Well, I like to do a how I became an anarchist video. I always really like these videos. I think it's interesting to see how it is people come to the conclusions that they have. This is true of basically any position, but when someone takes a fairly radical position, I usually think that's a little bit more interesting than someone who just is going with the crowd, which I think is the case with most people. You know, if you look at most people who identify as either just regular conservative or regular liberal or regular Democrat or regular Republican, there's usually not very much rigor. You know, there is a lot of ideology out there for people who want to be serious conservatives or serious liberals, but the vast majority of the people who identify as such uh, don't avail themselves. So very few conservatives will ever have bothered to say read Russell Kirk or Nisbet or John T. Flynn or any number of other people. And I mean, how many liberals have really gone and read that many treatises on democracy? Very few. If you look at libertarian anarchists, though, they pretty much all have done quite a bit of reading. Otherwise, they probably wouldn't be where they're at. Um, anyway, uh, for me personally, I think it's important to point out where your upbringing was. And for me, both of my parents are moderate Democrats. Um, my father is in a union. He's a teacher. He's in a teachers union. He's very active in his union. Always has been since way before I was around, and still is, and is very much in accordance with that. But on the other hand, he's moderately religious. We didn't go to church, but he is a Christian. His family's fairly Christian, and we also were basically rural people, especially where my parents first lived together and where I first grew up was in extremely. It was basically one of the most rural places in the eastern United States, and basically a giant forest. And uh, so he's very much into hunting. He's very much for the right to own guns. Although he didn't own guns, he bow hunted, but he thought that obviously people should have the right to own guns. Um, and uh, you know, fiscally conservative, roughly more so now. But and my mom basically followed his lead. She's more or less apolitical, like I said, but she follows his. Now her family are all her brothers are Republicans, and one of them, and who I'll come to later, is strongly ideological, and he is a radical minarchist and an objectivist, although I would say he's also a neocon. I'll come to that in a minute, though, since he plays a role later in our tale here. Um, Whatever their beliefs, though, they did not really make any conscious effort, as far as I'm aware, to inculcate me into them. They did not give me political lectures, and really they did not discuss politics very much, and they never have, and they very rarely do. They're just not that interested in it. They're interested in their own lives, and so I don't. I mean, obviously they're my parents, so they must have had an influence, but it wasn't very overt. Now, growing up, I was kind of a nerd, and I watched TV a lot. I basically grew up on TV. It's not to say I didn't have friends or ever play outside or anything like that. It wasn't that bad. But I could very easily spend 8 hours on a Saturday watching just the Discovery Channel. That's what I would watch, would be the Discovery Channel, or when it came along, the Learning Channel, and eventually the History Channel. When I was 10, I got very interested in history because I went to Gettysburg when I was 10, and that started my interest in history. But before that, I had really been interested in like animals and David Attenborough. I remember I had the Trials of Life series. I used to be able to basically name every single chordate in the world. I mean, there are very. Oh, duty calls. Sorry, I am actually at work. I wasn't expecting to get a call, but wasn't anything major. Anyway, so growing up, I really cared a lot about the environment, and I was definitely, although I didn't know the term, I was certainly a Malthusian. I thought overpopulation was a big problem. I worried about the rainforest and extinctions and pollution, and I mean, I thought Earth Day was really cool, and I watched Captain Planet, and although I didn't like it any more than any number of other cartoons I really liked. Um, and although I certainly wouldn't have known the terms, I think it would be very accurate to say that I was a socialist, because if you were to have posed any kind of societal problem to me of whatever type, be it overpopulation or pollution or unemployment or welfare or crime, I would have instinctively, maybe not instinctively, but just automatically said, well, the government should pass a law. And there was no hesitation to come to that conclusion. And I think I was more like this than your average kid my age, because I was more interested in, I wasn't only thinking about playing or whatever. Maybe I'm being unfair to the majority of other people, but I really was worried about things like overpopulation and population control and all that. And I was definitely a socialist. Now, the earliest explicit political memory I have is when the Republicans took Congress in, I believe, 1994. And I remember my parents were upset about it because the Democrats lost, and this was bad. Of course, I didn't know what a Republican was, and it just seemed like, at that point, I remember just thinking that democracy was kind of like the pinnacle of society. Anything less than that was literally like, would be barbarism, would be like Nazi Germany. And the fact that the Republicans, whoever they were in charge now, that was really, I mean, I was actually a little nervous. I mean, I heard about things like the Holocaust, and that's another thing. I remember my parents would talk about the Holocaust. I don't know why. They're not history buffs. They're certainly not Jewish. And they would say things, well, I mean, they could come and me and your dad, or, your parents might go on a train, and then you might go someplace. I mean, I don't know why they would tell me that stuff. They're not libertarians. They don't view the state in any kind of antagonistic terms. But they would tell me stories like that when I was very, very young, before I was 5, I'm sure. And for some reason I thought, the Republicans taking over, that's what that meant. And this was probably the way I would have stayed for a long time. But then in 1993, my parents bought me a comprehensive almanac, a big, thick book. And I read that thing probably 4 or 5 times over. It had all kinds of facts and figures, we expect in an almanac, rainfall and water temperatures, and it had all these production figures. I remember had the largest lakes by area in the world, so I used to know I'm down to like 20, but the first one is the Caspian Sea, and then Lake Superior, and then Lake Victoria, and then Lake Baikal, and then Lake Michigan and Huron, and on and on and on. And then I remember reading that Mongolia had 21 sheep for every person, and the lowest population density, and Hungary produced more bauxite. Anyway, I read through that. Well, at one section they had a long section where they did write-ups on every single country, a couple paragraphs. It would be like before we had Wikipedia. This is kind of the best you could hope for. And I read all of them at one point or another, and ones I was more interested in I'd read multiple times. And of course the write-up for the United States was much longer than any of the other ones. And it was very, very laudatory, the United States is the best or whatever. And I had the Constitution in there. And that was when I first started to read the Constitution. And it was interesting because I was reading the Constitution and I was realizing, well, the way the government is now seems rather different than what's described in this document. Now, this didn't alarm me at all. I figured, well, there must be some good answer as to why this isn't the case anymore. History's progressed a lot since then. Surely there's a good reason for this. There probably from time to time some kind of crisis would emerge, and an additional function would be added one way or another. Now, it wasn't in the amendments. They had the amendments up to that point, which I believe would have been all of them. I don't think there's been any since that time, and they didn't account for it either. Like I said, it didn't alarm me, but I became aware, and I just figured, well, I'm still young. I'm like in elementary school still, probably at that point, and it's likely that I'll learn about these things as I grow up. And I know when I was in 6th grade, so I would have been about 13 then, I remember the first day in class we were asked to write what we would do if we ran the world, and I remember, among other things, writing that I would annihilate India and China because I wanted to rid the earth of the excess population. However, very, very soon, at some point when I was about 12, I had a conversation with my uncle. Now, my mom has 3 brothers, and the youngest, she has one that's like the oddball who's more than 10 years younger than all the other ones, and like 15 years younger than the oldest one. And he's way different from all of his other ones. He's way more intellectual, and he always was. And he was in the military, and he's a radical minarchist, libertarian, objectivist, basically, although he doesn't like the Libertarian Party, and he votes Republican because he hates the Democrats. So anyway, I was talking to him, and he was all up on the conspiracy theories about David Rockefeller and all that. And this is way before the internet. This would have been around 1995, 96. And he even subscribed to Foreign Affairs, which is the publication of the Council on Foreign Relations. He'd subscribed to it for more than a decade up to, at that point. And I mean, we used to talk history everyone. You know, we didn't see each other that often. We lived hundreds of miles apart. But, you know, at Christmas, maybe once or twice a year, maybe at Christmas, maybe once in the summer, we'd see each other. And it was probably at Christmas, and I was at his house, and we had we'd have hours and hours of discussion about history. And I don't know what his intent was, but he just gave me the whole conspiracy theory, which most of you have probably heard something along the lines. Very similar to the book None Dare Call It Conspiracy. Basically, that David Rockefeller took over the country after World War I because the Congress voted down not to join the League of Nations and whatnot. And this really kind of terrified me quite a bit. And I kept trying to tell myself, well, this can't really be true, but it made a lot of sense, and it certainly explained a lot of the things, because what I discovered is that there weren't good reasons why the Constitution had changed, or why the government did more things than the Constitution laid out. And here was somebody, a trusted authority figure, basically offering me a plausible solution to that question. Why was the government doing so much more now? And there was that, and then the other thing is, I think at some point around this time I saw Waco, the Rules of Engagement, or some other documentary about Waco, and this had a very, very profound effect on me, because prior to this I basically viewed the state as beneficent and benevolent, and that it did things for our own good, and that you know, we might argue that this or that policy could be more or less effective if it was handled in a different way, but it was certainly not anything to be feared. And anyone who studies what happened at Waco at all, I don't care what book you read about it, what documentary, I mean, since then I've done a lot of study in it, but there's no way to conclude anything other than the fact that the government, the federal government in particular, mass murdered, well, 72, 73 people, most of them children, all of them innocent of really anything worthy of the death penalty. You might say that David Koresh maybe had committed statutory rape against some kids, but then you know, when that happens, you don't murder all the children that you have been statutory raped. I mean, even David Koresh you would have to put on trial before you kill. And this, suddenly the idea was in my head that the state, although I still thought was benevolent, or at least could do good, I also realized, well, it can also do evil. It can do bad things as well. And it wasn't hard with my study of history to just see this, that, you know, what happened to Waco is just kind of like a tiny speck of dust compared to what governments have done. Obviously, the first and foremost thing that would have come to my mind that would have been like the Holocaust. But I mean, it's every war you ever read about, which when you read history, that's pretty much almost always what you read about, is going to be at one end or another is going to be a mass murder. And so at this point, I had this idea that, well, the state is still can do good, but it can do bad. And what this caused me to do is to gradually start to examine certain issues from the perspective that it might not always make sense to have the government be involved in certain things. And the very first one that I really spent a lot of time on was on gun control. And I don't know why, again, because there were no guns in my house. My dad liked to hunt, but he bow hunted, so we had no guns. I never shot a gun until I was in my mid-20s. And I'm not exactly sure where the impetus, because this is before the internet. I mean, I didn't start surfing the web till I was in college. So I don't know where I was getting this from, but I became very convinced that there should be no regulations whatsoever on gun ownership, and the reason for that is to act as a check against the potential tyranny of the government. And this happened pretty quick, because like I said, when I was in 6th grade, I was a Malthusian, but I remember when I was in 7th grade, they had us write about what we would be doing in 20 years, and I wrote that I would be living on an island in the Canadian Arctic writing anti-government books. So there was a fairly quick transition over the course of about a year, maybe 18 months, where I really went from a well-meaning kid who looked at this government as like daddy who's going to fix everything to somebody who distrusted it more than even your average Tea Party person would today. And so I started studying guns, and that's basically where I was all through high school. I gradually learned more history, and I gradually became slowly more and more of a minarchist, although I didn't know the term, although not radically so. I think I still would have been just a Republican, although I didn't have the opportunity to vote. Now, when I went to college, the atmosphere in classes was not really that intellectually stimulating, at least by and large. I think in all the years I was there, there were maybe 1 or 2 times where it was, you know, worth going to class, but mostly it wasn't. However, there was a local television show called The Battle of Ideas, hosted by a man named John Mangopoulos. I'll try and find a link and put it on the sidebar. There's a few videos of him on YouTube, although not many, especially considering the vast majority. Now, this is a guy who had run a local broadcast show in Lansing, Michigan, at that point for more than 10 years, and at this point more than 20 years or thereabouts. And he, how would I say this, is a radical minarchist evangelical Christian. He would call himself a true conservative or a Christian conservative. And to give you some idea of where this guy would stand is he believed taxes were theft, but he thought government was mandated by God in the Bible. And so he thought that the government should charge user fees. He was against the Iraq War. He called it a war for Israel. He was virulently pro-life. In fact, he was famous because he would run for office on a third-party ticket. And rather than run ads trying to say vote for me, he would run commercials that would just show actual abortions taking place. And apparently the law is that if he's running for office, they have to air whatever he gives them. And so they would actually air, and he would have them air them like during Barney. And so people would be watching Barney or Dora the Explorer or whatever, and there would be video of aborted fetus. I mean, I've seen some of the videos. They're extremely graphic, and he did that on purpose. And this guy was very, very confrontational. It was a call-in show. You could call in, and he would be telling people, you're going to hell, you're an idiot, you're a Jezebel, you're a whore, I mean, just everything. But it was intellectually stimulating, and I found myself agreeing with him on a lot of things when it came to government and minarchism. And basically, at that point, my minarchism really crystallized into the defense, law, and what's the other ones really common? Just those two, I think. Like, we should have courts and we should have the military and police, and that was it. And that roads and education and all. He always railed against education, and I mean, he homeschools his kids. He had 6 children when I left, and he probably has more now. And let me tell you, I've met them, and his kids are really, really smart. They know a great deal more than your average public school. Anyway, so I was a very, very strong minarchist, and that was my position through most of college. And then through this guy, just John Mangopoulos. John Mangopoulos really is a great admirer of. Oh, here's another thing. Mangopoulos would actually host little lectures twice a year. He'd have a lecturer come in, and it would be free, and you could go and watch. And I went to several of these. And one year, he actually had Lou Rockwell come. So I actually went and heard Lou Rockwell lecture, and actually afterwards we went out and had lunch at Applebee's. And talked for a couple more hours, and it was really fun. But before I was an Austro-libertarian. I had no idea what Austrian economics was, or anything like that. And it was I was a minarchist, but I was a conservative. I would call myself very right wing at the time. So it was kind of a missed opportunity. I remember it very well, but I'm sure he doesn't. This Mangopoulos character also introduced me to Ron Paul. It didn't take long from watching the show to realize that there's basically nobody in politics who even approached anything close to what he was talking about. And at one episode, he said, well, there is one congressman I support. And I was like, what? There can't possibly be somebody who meets this standard of, principle. And he said, Ron Paul, Republican of Texas. And I remember looking him up online, and that's when the name first popped in. This is probably 2002 or 2003. But anyway, this man, this John Mangopoulos, was a great supporter of a writer who recently passed away named Joe Sobran. Now, Joe Sobran is an arch Catholic, but he used to be the chief editor of National Review, William F. Buckley's neoconservative or conservative paper for many, many years. And he was the kind of guy who you'd see as a pundit on television. There's a few clips of him being like on CNN back in the early 90s. But he was very, very principled, and he came out against the first Gulf War in a very cunning, interesting way. You should see him talk. There's actually a video of him on a TV show with Ron Paul and one other fellow. If you probably type Joe Sobran and Ron Paul on YouTube, we'll probably find it, and it's worth the watch. Anyway, he became an anarcho-capitalist. And I found this out because I really like Joe Sobran's writing, and this alluded that he was an anarcho-capitalist. And I remember I called John's show one time. I said, this Joe Sobran guy you really like, you say he's conservative, but you believe in government and he doesn't. And he said, well, the reason he doesn't is because he read a book called Democracy, the God That Failed by Hermann Hoppe. And my interest was immediately piqued. I didn't run out and buy it. I was in college. I had no money. Now, this is kind of an interesting... Well, I'm going to stop it here because this is going to be super fucking long, but... yeah, at this point, there's kind of a nexus between the conspiracy theorists and the more theoretical libertarianism. So it's about to get interesting. Well, at least to me. Maybe not to you, but we'll see.